Hi there YouTube. So we're back. I'm working on the Tekno SCT410.3 team build for turf racing. Today we're going to be working on bags N through P, which is essentially all the electronics. So first thing on the electronics that we put together is the servo. So I went with the Savox SC1265TG high torque titanium gear servo. I chose this servo for a couple of reasons. One, I wanted a goodly amount of torque because this is a very heavy truck. So this servo comes with provides 278 ounces of torque. Now that amount of torque comes at a price, and what you do is you lose a little bit of speed. So you can't have high torque and high speed. You have to make a balance of the two. So with this servo, you get a 0.15 second for a 60-degree arc on the speed. Now that's a little slow, I think, for a racing rig. Normally I try to look for a 0.10. My stock 17.5 two-wheel drive buggy, I think I have 0.7 on it for a servo. Thing is super fast, very twitchy. So I know this is a heavier vehicle, and I was looking for something with a lot of torque for that weight, but I think I may have overshot the mark, and I lost a little bit on the speed. So it would have been nice to maybe go with the 1268 SG. The SG is for steel gears. And so you gain a little bit of weight over this titanium gear version, but you also lose some torque, right? So the 68 would have 208 ounces of torque, which is still plenty, I think, for this truck. But you'd pick up some speed and go to 0.13 seconds in a 60-degree arc rather than the 0.15, which I think might be a better balance for this truck. So when putting together a steering system, I like the steering mount and the steering arms and all of that stuff to be very firm and solid. I don't like any bend or flexy because that then introduces inaccuracy, slowdowns, and stuff like that. For a basher, you want that flexibility, but for a race truck, not necessarily so much. So I went ahead when I was buying the parts for this. This is not part of the team build, but I upgraded to the carbon fiber steering servo brace. Normally, I just upgrade to metal, not having laid hands on this truck or known anybody that had built it or anything. I didn't realize that this came with a metal servo brace already. So I probably would not buy the carbon servo brace. I think that the metal servo brace is probably just fine. However, I bought it, so I'm going to use it. And this is the part number for that. So there's a few things that I do when I'm building up a vehicle, especially with the servo. So one of the things that I always do is I use the rubber grommets that come with the servo. So one of the things I like about the Savox is that they have this trapezoidal shaped rubber grommet. There are 4 of them for all 4 holes in the servo. When you put these in, you want to put the larger part on the bottom and then a smaller part on the top. There is a ridge that's at this spot right here. Right at 12 o'clock on this picture there's a ridge, and that goes to the outside of the servo case, right? So when you install those, you then want to also install the metal tube. It's got some flashing on one end, that's the top. I use my hex driver. I put the little metal tube on the hex driver, and then I insert the tip of the hex driver into the hole here in the rubber grommet, and then that guides the tube down through the rubber. If you try to just do it with your fingers, it's a pain in the butt. So use that hex driver to guide that down, and then that will seat these metal tubes inside the rubber grommet. And what that metal tube does is it acts as a rigid point to which the screw will then tighten down on. So you're not tightening down on the plastic case of the servo, you're not tightening down on the rubber grommet. What you're tightening down on is this metal tube. So the bottom of the metal tube hits the brace, the top of the metal tube hits the screw head, and then it's solid, that metal tube. And what that allows these grommets to do is give just a tiny bit of shock absorption for the servo. And doing this will increase the life of your servo tremendously. So I can't encourage you enough to use these when you're building up your servo. Now, not all servos have such a nice little metal tube. Many of them, the tube itself is too narrow for an M3 screw to go through, but not with the Savox. So that's one of the reasons why I like this brand servo, and I use it on all my racing trucks, because I can continue to use the M3 screws that are needed to mount the servo to the car, and I don't have to go down to a size M2, which then oftentimes doesn't thread into the plastic body. So this is the side pod here with the servo attached in. As you can see, the cord will run lengthwise down here, so you need to be careful. Don't go fancy with your servo and get one of these Savox Black Editions or some of these other brands that have shortened cables, right? Because those shortened cables are designed for like 4-wheel drive 10-scale buggies or 2-wheel drive 10-scale buggies, where the servo is mounted right up in the front of the vehicle and then the receiver is smack dab close by. So you're going to need the full length servo cable when building this truck, because the servo is in the back end of the rig. So this is just a close-up of what that mounted up looks like, and then on the other direction here. So you can see the washer sits on top and that metal tube is on the inside here, and this is how that all looks up. So it looks really nice. I just don't know it's worth the expense, given that it does come with a metal servo bracket. Now, there are 3 mounting positions in this side pod here that you use these little rubber O-rings, and on top of this the ESC mounting plate then screws through. So these little O-rings acts as a bit of a shock absorber for the ESC mounting plate, which is very trick. And they say to use some CA glue to glue them down. So I went ahead and used that rubber infused CA glue that I used on the tires, and let that sit for a good 5 or 10 minutes after I set that up. So as you can see, I just ran a small bead of the CA glue around in the track, just enough to coat it, and then I used my tweezers to set the O-ring down into the spot, and this is what it looks like with all 3 of these things sitting there. You want to make sure that you put just enough to coat the bottom. This is starting to come up just a little bit. That was probably just a tiny bit too much, because you don't want that CA glue to come up over the top. You just want it to be on the very, very bottom edge. So now it's time to start mounting up the speed control. So for this build, I'm using Hobbywing Electronics. So the speed control is the Xeron XR8 SCT Pro. What a mouthful that is. This is a big, beefy, powerful speed control. I have Hobbywing electronic speed controls in a lot of my other cars. I've had very good luck with them. They're easy to set up. They appear to be well built, so I went ahead and went with that. The other primary alternative that I've seen for a sensored motor setup for these 4-wheel drive is the Tekno RX system, RX8 I think it is. Those are easily twice, if not more, the price of the Hobbywing gear. So given that I've had such good luck with my Hobbywing gear in the past, I went ahead and used it for this as well. In my son's Losi, we do use the looking at my camera, the Castle Mamba Max Pro, and that ESC is okay, but it has a very weak BEC. That's the battery electronic circuitry that powers the servo. And we had to add an external BEC to that speed control, which then drove the cost up more. So while I do like the Castle stuff, I've got it in a number of my bashers, I didn't like the fact that its BEC was so underpowered, and it's apparently a known issue. I don't know if they've updated their newest version, because we're running off of about a 1.5-year old version now, and there's been a new version to come out, and I'm not sure if they've addressed that shortcoming, but it's been a known shortcoming for a while with the Castle stuff. And a glitch buster doesn't fix the problem with the Castle stuff. Only an external BEC will do that. So while that's what he's running in his rig, I went ahead and gave this Hobbywing a try. So pro tip: remove the fan from the ESC before you solder on all your wires, because if you don't, you'll possibly, like I did, hit the fan power plug with the soldering iron tube and cause it to melt, which I'm very embarrassed that I did this, but I'm not embarrassed enough, I guess, to put it for the world to see. So I did this. It appears that all I did was melt the edge of the plastic. So what I did was I went ahead and used some heat shrink tubing to create a new sleeve, and it seems to work just fine. While the speed control did come with a spare fan, I decided, well, I'll go ahead and use this one until it stops working, and then I'll install the spare. So pro tip, go ahead and remove the fan and unplug this wire before you start soldering up your wires. So moving on to the receiver, I'm using Futaba receivers, and they're pretty small. Now I do have the antennaless in my stock buggy, but I have a few of these antennas that came with my transmitter, and the gentleman that I bought the transmitter from, Race Nitro, and all of his receivers have antennas, which I think is fine, so I'm going to use them. So that's why I have this antenna. If I were to build this from with all brand new gear, right, or gear that I didn't already have, I think I probably would go again with the antennaless. I haven't had any problems running an antennaless. Now some people will take the antenna and just coil it up inside the receiver box, and then it's fine. It's kind of like a pseudo antennaless. I did not do that. This image here, I'm showing you this because of the tape that I use. I use a 3M VHB tape. There's a number of them out there. This one I believe is the 4910. It's a clear gel type tape. I was first discovered this when I bought some Novak, a bag of Novak ESC tape, and this is what it was. All they did was they bought a roll, cut it into smaller pieces, stick it in a bag, and upcharge for it. So after that discovery, I just went ahead and bought a roll of it my own self, and I cut it to the size that I need. So the nice thing about this is that it's a gel, and just like gel in your sneakers or in your shoe insoles, it has a fair amount of shock absorption. So for my receiver, I use one strip thick, and on my receivers I double it up and I use two. So this is already thicker than most servo tapes, and when you put two of them together, two thicknesses, it really adds a fair amount of cushion to that ESC when it takes hits and stuff. So this is the receiver, this is the tape. I went ahead and took a picture of it with the full piece on it, and then I go back through with the scissors and I cut the excess off before I put it down. Another little pro tip for you is go ahead and use some alcohol on a cotton ball to clean off the back of any, whether it's the speed control or your receiver or whatever, clean the back of the item, then put the tape down on it. Be careful not to get your finger on the sticky surface of the tape, because the oil from your finger will then ruin the adhesion. I find that especially true with this VHB on the gel type stuff. And then also clean, even if it's brand new, clean wherever you're sticking it down in. And if it's taking too long for the alcohol to dry, maybe you use too much, you just need to get it just damp. You don't need it to be dripping or anything like that. You can use a canned air to clean it, to dry it off a little faster. When you're using an antenna, is another little pro tip that I learned. So the antenna has this protective sheath on it, and then this bit here is really the antenna. This here is just an extender to get it up away from the electronics and up away from the ground, because these frequencies, the 2.4 gigahertz, very short wavelengths compared to the old AM/FM stuff, and you want to get this antenna, this bit of the antenna, as high from the ground as possible to avoid ground interference. It's especially true if you're running a nitro truck, because there's a lot of extra interference inside that vehicle than what we have in our electric vehicles, so you want to get this up as high as possible. So if you are running nitro, do not wrap your antenna inside the receiver box. So you put the antenna into the antenna tube. Never ever cut the antenna, because this is the bit of the antenna that's functional. All of the rest of this is just an extension. So go ahead and put it so that the tip of the antenna is flush with the antenna tube, and then put your antenna cap on. It is a common, I made this mistake for years, to go ahead and install the antenna in the tube so that the protector is flush, and then you fold this part of the antenna over and put the cap on. So what that effectively does is, because remember, this is protective shielding, right? So when you fold your antenna down, now 180 degrees is shielded from your signal. So depending upon where the fold is on the vehicle, whatever that shielding is facing you create an eclipse effect with your radio signals. So you want to make sure that this bit of the antenna is intact, and inside the antenna tube, make the tip of this flush with the antenna tube. I push the last little millimeter down in, and then I put the tube on top, the tube cap on top. Okay, so moving on, we've got the battery box. Now the battery box screws in with the 6 screws, which is amazingly secure, and this vehicle comes with 3 Velcro straps, one that goes longitudinally and 2 that transverse it. I don't really like the transverse straps. If I was running this with a 3S or something like that, or maybe even a 4S, I might need all the extra straps, but I think I can get away with just the longitudinal one. Now you can see right here that I've applied a full strip of the Tamiya thicker foam tape. This is a single-sided, not a double-sided, single-side stick, high density foam tape that Tamiya makes. And I went the entire width because my stick pack that I'm using in this battery box was designed to be used with these extra straps. So I put this one piece of foam tape in that just gives that battery a little better snug fit. It's not totally snug, I don't have to jam it in there, but it doesn't wiggle around, and then I can just strap it down with a longitudinal strap, and it's in there perfect. With 2S, I think this is a great way to go. We now need to put the motor in. As you can see, my motor is in. Here's the shaft. This is a 5mm shaft, so if you're coming from 10th scale cars or something like that, that was a 3.5mm, so none of your pinions are going to fit. It's also mod 1, which is a different gear cut. So I went ahead and got the Tekno hardened steel pinion gear. Now, there's lots of different choices out there and stuff you could go with. I think we're using Castle pinions on my son's car, and that seems to be just fine as well. With this setup, I'm going to use a 15T because it's a smaller track. It's a more technical track, so I think that the 15T is going to be a great place to start. I do have a 16T that I may go to, but I think that this is going to be just fine. So this is what I'm running for pinion gear. Now, another little tip that I didn't learn until I was racing is to use a piece of paper. So I cut a piece of regular printer paper, just a little wider than the width of the pinion, and about 2 inches long. And then I pull the motor all the way out, put the paper in, push the motor back in to mesh with the gear so that the paper, as you can see, is crimped between the pinion and the spur. Then I tighten down the motor mount screws, and then that gives me the proper mesh. There's enough slack between the teeth of the pinion and the spur so that they have good engagement, but not so tight that things are binding up. So between the metal spur and the hardened pinion, I think I'm going to have a pretty robust center diff motor connection. If I were running this on the big track that's a clay surface and has a lot more dust and little pebbles and stuff, I'd be very comfortable knowing that this pinion and spur, the mesh are good and they're strong enough to squish any little pieces of clay that might get jammed in. This is the best way to get, well, not the best way, but a very reliable way to make sure that your spur and pinion mesh is set properly. Also, I used a little bit of Tamiya anaerobic gel on the pinion gear to make sure it doesn't back out. Same thing with the mounting screws. Wherever it calls for thread lock, almost exclusively I'm using the Tamiya anaerobic gel. Only in a few places did I use the normal blue thread lock. So, mounting up the speed control. When I originally wired this up, I had my 3 motor wires going away from center of the speed control, and then my battery wires going away from center on the speed control, because I don't like having things mushed up like this. And when I shared this picture in the Facebook forums for the Texas Racers, a few people recommended that I point the wires in towards center of the chassis rather than away from center of the speed control. So even though this is a short course truck, if this were being used, because same chassis is used for e-buggy, certainly I couldn't run them this direction on an e-buggy, but on a short course truck I figured, hey, I got plenty of space. But they recommended no, go ahead and run them this direction. So I went ahead and resoldered these ends to point this direction. The other thing that they mentioned is that leaving the speed control just mounted to the mounting plate with the double-sided tape was insufficient. It also could cause cracking on the speed control case. So to avoid that, they recommended using a zip tie. Now, if you look, there are notches pre-made in the mounting plate for a zip tie to go through. So I went ahead and got a blue zip tie, and I zip tied it up and tied it off and clipped the end. Now I put the bracket part here because it allowed me to get the zip tie nice and snug without over cinching it, because I didn't want to squish anything down. So it's really nice and snug, and putting this here allowed it to go flush with this edge, right? So it wasn't in any weird spots where this was causing an interference. It actually was working pretty good. So that's why I got the zip tie facing this direction. Moving on to the steering setup. All right, so like I said before, I don't like using plastic parts in my steering configuration for pretty much anything, race trucks in particular. And I always use a metal steering horn. Plastic steering horns, unless it's a direct servo saver kind of setup, I don't like using plastic on my servo horn. So I went with Tekno aluminum single-sided clamping servo horn with 25T because the Savok servo uses 25 tooth spline. This is the part number for that, and then this is the parts from the one of the smaller bags in the larger bag O for the steering setup. And this is what it looks like when it's all set up. There are two holes on the servo horn. As you can see, I'm using the outer horn, not the outer hole, not the inner hole. And I also reversed the direction that this screw goes into the bell crank, because they had the nut on the bottom side. It wasn't fitting well in the plastic. I didn't like the way that looked. I think it also would make it a bigger pain to adjust or disassemble anything in the future, because if that nut kept falling out, it just seemed like a disaster. So I went ahead and reversed the screw so that both of the nuts in the steering arm were on top. So that's why I've got this set up. Also, you might not be able to see the threaded shaft here, right? I found the midpoint with a pair of calipers. I found the midpoint, and then I took my fine tip paint marker, that one I was telling you about, and I put one tiny little line that was exactly 1 millimeter in width. And that way, when I tightened it down, I used my hex driver and screwed it into right up to the edge of the silver line that I drew into the one, and then I put my another hex driver shaft through the ball connector here, and then I put another one through the ball connector here and tightened it down, and that gave me some leverage. And as I tightened, I tightened it up to about the edge of the silver, and then I measured it with my calipers, and sure enough, it was exactly 1 millimeter as called for. But by doing this, it ensured that I had an equal amount of threads in both sides of these ball ends. Okay, so that's why you can't hardly even see it, but there's a tiny little silver line here that I painted on with that fine paint marker tip. So here's one of the other modifications that I did, and that's I added a glitch buster. I try to run a glitch buster in all of my race rigs. This one here, they come in different sizes. It doesn't matter which one you get. Some of them are narrower and longer. This one is a little bit fatter. It doesn't really fit well in my 10th scale buggies very much, so I didn't use it in those. but it worked really well for this. So on the opposite side of the chassis from the receiver, you can just barely make out the receiver in the top left corner of the picture here. There's this mounting spot for what I must assume is either the throttle or a brake servo for the nitro. I don't run nitro. I know very little about them, but I do know that they have multiple servos, one for steering, one for throttle. I think there's also one for brake, maybe not. Maybe the throttle is the brake. Regardless, there's another servo for the throttle for sure, and I think that's what mounts here when this is set up for nitro. I do wish they made a plate, a cover, just a plate that we could put over this to tidy up the look of the build when it's done, because it's just left open and ugly like this. But it afforded me a really fantastic spot for this glitch buster. So I ran the glitch buster wires around the back where the servo wires are intended for the other servo and into the receiver box. You need to make sure that your receiver has enough spots for it, right? So you need a 4-channel minimum receiver, one for steering, one for speed control, one for your transponder, and then one for your glitch buster. And that's what I did. I went ahead and put a little bit of extra shrink wrap here over the ends, right? I used a piece of clear shrink heat tubing so that I gave a little bit of extra protection back here for this bend that I knew was going to be coming. And then I used a tiny little blob of shoe goo to affix the capacitor, this glitch buster capacitor, into this back corner. And the wire was perfect length. There was no extra wound up inside the receiver box. It just went in just fine. One thing I do wish I would have done is I mounted it flush right up against the outside of this wall. And I kind of wish I would have given myself maybe a millimeter of slack, because the shoe goo, if you don't know, when it dries, it's a little rubbery, so it acts as a great little shock absorber for the capacitor, so it's not going to induce any shocks into the capacitor, except for like a dummy. I mounted it right up against this, which means there are going to be some impact forces put onto this capacitor. But it's there now. I'm going to go ahead and run with it. If it gets damaged, I'll remove it all, peel the shoe goo off, put a new one in, and make sure that I leave about a millimeter space between the edge of this side pod and the cap top. So that would be my recommendation if you're going to follow my lead. Use a glitch buster. Again, this is what I'm using. Doesn't matter what you use. A little blob of shoe goo, but give yourself just enough breathing room so that any impacts are going to allow some space for this wall to come in before it actually hits the capacitor. So this is what it looks like with the motor connected. So again, I am using the Hobbywing Z-Run 4-pole motor. I'm using the 4300 kV motor. This is the part number here. It's very well built. It's a little plain looking. I think some of the other motors out there are a little bit nicer looking. But the tabs, the direction that they go on, I found that this was the best way to solder up the wire. Now, there are lots of different ways to solder up the wire, and a lot of my other builds, I have less wire, and I oftentimes would get down on people who had these longer wires. And what I discovered is having the longer wires, that extra slack was nice, because now I can actually remove the motor from the motor mount and I can move it around. It's not just tied just straight there, and I can hardly even move it, maybe not even pull it out of the motor mount at all because the wires are so short. And then I got to crack out my soldering iron and desolder and then resolder. And multiple soldering maybe is not the best thing ever. Having a good solder point done and over with and not having to undo and redo all the time is maybe a better choice. At any rate, so I went ahead and used the wires that came with the motor. These black 12 gauge wires came with the motor, and I went ahead and used them full length. Because having a little bit of extra slack, I found, helps in the long run during maintenance. So the same thing is true for the battery wires. I went ahead and left those full length. They came with the ESC, and I'm using the bullet connectors, and I use the straight bullet connector rather than the 90-degree angle. I use the 90-degree angle in my 10th scale buggy, and what I found is removing those was such a pain, right? But these, because I've got extra space underneath that big short course body, I went ahead and used the straight 4mm bullet plugs. They plug right in. Takes me 2 seconds to pull them up. It's nice, plenty there to grab, super easy. So that's the reason why I went ahead and I just used the wires that came with the motor and the speed control, and I use them full length. And having a little bit of extra wire, while it might be a little bit ugly, not quite as tidy, probably would not work if I were building an e-buggy version, but for this short course, I like having that extra slack. So that's pretty much it. The last installment for this is going to be the shocks. I'm still waiting on a couple of parts for my shock build. I need the oil. The oil that I have is all too thin. So once that comes in, I'll go ahead and build it up, document it, and get that video up. And that will be it for the build. I'll try to do one more video on a run, right, to let you know how it works. Maybe get some input from other guys at the track to see what they think of this build and this setup. And then if I ever do anything major to it, I'll come back and I'll update this video series with any kind of major updates that I've done. So once again, I appreciate you watching. If you found this helpful, please leave a like. If you got any comments or questions, suggestions on how I could have done something better, questions on how you're doing something, I'll do my best to answer it. Appreciate you watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.